Hello and welcome back to my studio. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and as you can see here I've got quite a lot of watercolour paper pads, blocks and packs out to show you. And yes, you've guessed it, it's going to be a quick guide today to watercolour paper and my thoughts about the different surfaces and the different types. Watercolour papers are a little more absorbent than ordinary drawing paper, cartridge paper, printer paper, that sort of thing, and often much thicker or heavier weight. This is because we use water as the medium to get our paint to flow, and so the paper has to be a bit more absorbent to be able to cope with that water, but also to allow the transparent watercolour washes to look particularly luminous and beautiful on the paper. There are two main types of watercolour paper. There's those that are made from 100% cotton and those that are made either from cellulose pulp or a mixture of cotton and cellulose pulp. 100% cotton papers are generally considered to be the best and most suitable papers for watercolour painting, but this is of course down to personal choice, and also it could be down to expense as well, because the 100% cotton papers generally are more expensive than the pulp papers, but you can get some really good pulp papers, and I'll be showing you one of my favourites today a bit later on, although I do generally paint myself with 100% cotton paper. So those are the two main types. Then we have three different surface grains or textures. The first is rough, and this is an example of a sheet of rough watercolour paper, and you can see it's got lots of little dips and bumps. It's a lovely texture to paint on. The second is cold pressed, and this is the midpoint. So this is the sort of halfway house between the rough texture, so it's got a fine grain to it, but a marked grain nonetheless. And then the third surface type is hot press, and this is, as the name suggests, is made with a hot pressing process which kind of irons the paper in a way and creates an incredibly smooth surface. And you can see here it is really smooth and silky almost to the touch compared to the two rougher textured papers, in other words the rough and the cold pressed. Cold pressed watercolour, that in between texture that's not quite as textured as the rough paper but has some texture, unlike the hot press, which is really smooth, is the one that's generally recommended for beginners. It's a lovely texture to use. A lot of landscape painters use the rough textured paper as well, but that's a little bit harder to manage. It really does absorb a lot of paint, and so I would advise beginners to start with cold pressed watercolour paper to start with, and then if you find that you really enjoy exploiting the texture, then move on to rough and see whether you like it. Hot press watercolour paper is usually used for much finer work, like botanical paintings, where a really beautiful amount of detail is required, and it can be a little bit more tricky to manage for landscape painting, but can still be done. So it's all down really to personal preference. So those are our three surface types: rough, cold press, which is sometimes known as knot, N-O-T, and hot press. And these are the same for cotton paper and pulp paper. They all come in those three surface types. I'll now get a sample of each type of paper, each surface grade, and show you the difference between them just by sort of swatching out a bit of paint on them, so that you'll hopefully be able to see the different effects that you get by using a different surface texture. And then I'll move on to talking about the differences between cotton paper and pulp paper. And then I'll finish up with a quick look at different weights of watercolour paper and the different styles in which it comes, in other words, blocks, pads, packs, etc. But first, just before I get into the demo, I'd just like to give you a very quick preview of my new book, Landscapes in Watercolour Techniques and Tutorials for the Complete Beginner, published by GMC or Guild of Master Craftsmen Publications. There's lots in here about equipment and materials, including watercolour paper, colour theory, perspective, composition, and 10 step-by-step tutorials for you to follow. So please follow the links below if you're interested. So that's the quick plug done. Let's now get on with the demo. Here I've got 3 samples of the different paper textures. Over here on the left is my rough. In the middle I've got a piece of cold press or not, and over on the left is my hot press. I'm going to use cobalt blue and a flat brush and just swatch a bit of colour across the papers and see if I can sort of show you the difference quite quickly. As I said before, the rough surface paper is very textured and you have to sometimes work quite hard to get the paint evenly across the surface because it's so textured. So you can see I've pressed the brush in this first brush stroke and got a nice even brush stroke. But if I press slightly more lightly, then I am only skimming across the texture of the paper. Now this is fabulous because it means you can get dry brush really easily on rough surface paper, but it is trickier to paint. In other words, it's so textured, it takes a bit of experience, a bit of practice to get used to it. Whereas here with the cold press watercolour paper, you can see how much easier it is to get the paint evenly across the paper, but you can also get that nice dry brush effect as well because of the texture. And with hot press, it's so smooth, it's really easy to get the paint across the surface of the paper, but it does tend to sit on the surface a bit more, and because there's very little texture on the smooth paper, you don't really get much in the way of dry brush effects. So I hope that's just shown you quite quickly the difference between the texture types. But of course there's no substitute for trying these papers out yourself and seeing which ones you prefer, seeing which one you like the best for your own painting style. And a lot of paper manufacturers will sell sample packs very cheaply, so you can try out small pieces of the different types of paper, and that can be a really useful way of finding out about the kind of surfaces that you like before you commit to expensive watercolour paper pads or blocks. So take a look at your favourite online store or art store and see if they offer any sample packs for you to try out. So the next thing I want to talk about quickly is the weights of different watercolour paper. The heavier weight paper, the thinner it is. The thinner papers are much cheaper, but they are more likely to buckle when you apply water. The thicker weight papers will buckle less but are much more expensive, so it's finding that sort of compromise, and most people find that a good weight of paper to start with is £140 or 300 GSM. But of course you can avoid lighter papers buckling, or any papers buckling at all, if you pre-stretch your paper, and we've got a video on pre-stretching which I shall link in the description below. And now, as I promised earlier, a quick recommendation for a good, reasonably cheap pulp paper, which is here showing top left Bockingford paper by St Cuthbert's Mill. It's a pulp paper, but it's really good archival quality, a little bit more expensive than some of the pulp papers, but much cheaper than the cotton papers. And it takes the paint beautifully, it lifts really well, it's a fantastic paper and lots of professional artists use it. So if you're not sure whether you want to go to the expense of cotton watercolour paper, try the Bockingford paper out. I'm sure you'll absolutely love it. It's highly recommended paper. From a personal point of view, my favourite papers are also made by St Cuthbert's Mill, and they're the cotton papers. I love Saunders Waterford and Milford papers, and coming in a close second is the French paper manufacturer Arches. And the reason I prefer cotton watercolour paper is quite simply I find it much easier to paint on, and for me that's a big plus. But of course, as I've said before, it's all down to personal preference, so try out a few paper types and find out for yourself the ones that you like. And lastly, watercolour paper comes in quite a lot of different sizes, and that of course is down to preference. Try the smaller size out to start with, and then as you progress, either stick with that size if you like it, or maybe move slightly larger. But it also comes in different sort of formats. There are standard pads of watercolour paper with a sort of gummed top edge so that you remove a sheet and tape it to your board ready to paint. Another popular format are gummed blocks where all four sides are gummed together apart from a small access slot at the top, and then you paint straight onto the block, and once your painting's dry you remove it by inserting a palette knife into the little slot and releasing the sheet from the gummed borders, and that works to keep the paper fairly flat and stops it from buckling, so that's a useful format. And lastly, you can buy watercolour paper in full sheets or full imperial sheets. These are really large sheets of paper which the watercolour retailer will usually cut down for you into either half sheets or quarter imperial sheets, which is the size that I use, and then you can buy these as packs. And this is the format that I choose because I find that I can buy my papers in bulk, and it's a little bit cheaper than pads or blocks. So that just about winds up this quick introduction to watercolour paper for beginners, and I hope you found that helpful. And I'd love to know in the comments if you've got a particular type of watercolour paper that you could recommend to viewers. We'd love to sort of know what sort of papers you use and why you prefer them. So many thanks for watching. Please click on the thumbs up button and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And thank you so much to everyone that supports us on Patreon. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.